Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Chris Hernandez-Roy, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Americas Program at CSIS. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation on navigating geopolitics and security in Latin America's ports. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping announcements. Our discussion today will last approximately 60 minutes. If we have sufficient time, we'll field questions from the online audience following the panelists' remarks and a moderated discussion. Please submit questions by clicking the Ask Live Questions link on the event webpage. And at the end of the event, a survey will appear on your screen, and we'd be very grateful if you could fill it out. Again, thank you for joining us today. Ports are the catalyst for trade and commerce within Latin America and the Caribbean, and their outlet to the wider world. Their importance to the region's economic future is only set to grow, especially as Latin America looks to capitalize on its potential for nearshoring. However, for these same reasons, ports are appealing targets for criminal actors eager to capture their infrastructure to facilitate the movement of illicit goods abroad. While these challenges are not new, global shifts in illicit markets are helping to exacerbate their symptoms. Some of the key trends include rising demand for cocaine in Europe, a feature which has put a premium on transatlantic shipping from producer countries in South America. Indeed, the violence that has gripped Ecuador, and especially the port cities of Guayaquil and Duran, is directly linked to the country's growing importance as a transit point in the flow of illicit narcotics. Ports in Colombia, Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina are also seeing increases in cocaine flows. Efforts by criminal groups to diversify their revenue streams in recent years have also put a premium on ports for exporting illicit gold, timber, and wildlife products to international markets. While these commodities flow out from the region's ports, weapons flow back into the hands of organized crime. Under-resourced customs authorities mean that trafficking illicit firearms can be shockingly easy. Ports are also crucial entry points for chemical precursors, imported in large quantities from China, used for legitimate purposes, but also for the illicit manufacturing of synthetic drugs. In Mexico, especially, the country's Pacific coast has emerged as a new front in the clash between Chinese and Mexican criminal networks on the one hand, and U.S. efforts to stem the flow of fentanyl northward on the other. Port security should therefore be at the front lines of a regional effort to crack down on transnational criminal groups and improve the safety of all citizens. But this is easier said than done. More resources and technologies are needed, to be sure, but the region's importance as a transit hub means that such efforts are only as strong as their weakest link. Furthermore, customs authorities are often not appropriately integrated into national security institutions or international networks, preventing them from effectively sharing data and cracking down on increased illicit activity. Finally, geopolitical dynamics are also leading to closer scrutiny of the region's ports from a national security perspective. In a pair of recent commentaries, the CSIS Americas Program outlined these risks, in particular, noting concerns over Chinese constructed, owned, or operated ports in the region and their potential for dual use or disruption in the event of a confrontation with China. The lack of transparency associated with PRC-run port projects adds a further layer of opacity, which may exacerbate some of the criminal dynamics we already observe in Latin American ports. To help us better understand how the various trends are impacting port security across the Americas, we are joined today by hopefully four subject matter experts, although one of them is having technical difficulties at the moment. If she's able to join us, our first speaker is Dr. Carolina Sampo, a researcher with the National Scientific and Technical Research Council of Argentina. Her research focuses on gender, violence, organized crime, and criminal organizations in South and Central America. Dr. Sampo is also a consultant who has worked for international institutions such as the Organization of American States, UNODC, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Our next speaker is Leland Lazarus, Associate Director of the National Security at Florida International University's Gordon Institute for Public Policy and FIU's resident expert on China-Latin America relations. He was previously the special assistant and speechwriter to two four-star combatant commanders of U.S. Southern Command, and also served as Deputy Public Affairs Officer at U.S. Embassy in Barbados and as a U.S. Consular Officer in Shenyang, China. Our third speaker is Douglas Farah, President of IBI Consultants, a national security consulting firm. Mr. Farah worked as a foreign correspondent and investigative reporter with the Washington Post for more than 20 years, covering security in Latin America and West Africa. He's an expert on national security, transnational crime, terrorism, terror finance, and non-state armed actors. And our final speaker today is Henry Ziemer, Research Associate with the CSIS Americas Program and author of the recent CSIS commentary, The Geopolitics of Port Security in the Americas. His research with the Americas Program includes work on security and defense, as well as great power competition in the Western Hemisphere. With that introduction, I'd now like to turn over to our panel, and I'm glad to see that Carolina has joined us. If you could turn on your microphone, please, Carolina, and we'd very much like you to provide your opening remarks.
Hi, thank you so much, Christopher. I'm sorry I'm having technical difficulties in many ways you can imagine. I tried to with two different computers and the cell phone and everything failed, but we made it. So that's a good thing. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you. And my idea, at least, is to start to kick off this very interesting topic to discuss, especially because some years ago, a few years ago, I may say two probably, we finished with Valesca Troncoso a research regarding the role of southern corn ports in the cocaine trafficking. But when I'm speaking about cocaine trafficking, I may be speaking about different kind of illicits, right? Illicit trafficking. So especially I would have loved to share with you the different maps I have prepared for the occasion, but I'm sure you will get the sense at least of the idea. First of all, in the case of Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, we can point out that they seem to be very far away countries from the illicit chain in general, and specifically when we talk about cocaine. But nevertheless, since many of the traditional countries, we may say, like Colombia, Bolivia, of course, Peru, and even Brazil are having more controls and are being less used, not directly, but considering the amount of illicit trafficking we are seeing, these new countries, new in the sense of their role in the illicit market, has arisen, and their ports in particular have became very important. These three ports, Montevideo, Buenos Aires, and San Antonio, have big movements, and they don't raise red flags in the arrival ports. And we can think about Central America, North America, and Europe in different ways. And this may be a big advantage for criminal organization. And we have to think in geopolitics in how well they are located if we consider that they are very close to production and transit areas. They have very difficult to control border areas. They are fragile states, which is very difficult considering they don't have enough resources to work with in many cases. And in the case of Uruguay and Argentina, they are located at the end of the waterway, which is the way that Paraguay and Bolivia move most of their goods, considering they are landlocked. So what makes these ports important. Basically, they are critical if you want to move illicit goods and you don't want to be on the radar. If you want to be off the radar, these ports may be your choice. And as we know, criminal organizations are rational actors. So even when in many cases these routes may be more expensive, more slower, more difficult to reach, it may be a big option if they consider that they are high profit, low risk. So I just wanted to get into the topic and let the other panelists, my fellow panelists, continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carolina. There's going to be lots to unpack about the Southern Cone and these non-traditional ports and at what point they become more traditional. Leland, over to you, please.
Well, Chris, first and foremost, thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation to participate in this event. Same thing for you, Henry, and Carolina, Doug. It's a pleasure to be in this event with you. I want to start off by telling a quick story. Just a couple of months ago, I had the honor to participate in a roundtable that was organized by the Council of the Americas. And the topic was on port security and innovation in Central America. And one of the other participants there, he was an owner of a port there. He said that ports are the lungs of a country. And if the lungs are not working, then of course the country will suffocate. And I really took that to heart because, on one hand, countries have to deal with the delicate dance. On one hand, they need to make sure that the ports are flowing unobstructed. And for that reason, you can't really look at every single container that's flowing through a certain port. Otherwise, you would sort of cut down on its efficiency. But on the other hand, have the right protocols in place in order to make sure that it is safe and secure. And so how do you make sure that the ports are a good tool of trade, but at the same time not being used as a geostrategic chess piece? And so when you look at some of the efforts, international efforts to standardize port security procedures throughout the world, I immediately think of the 2003 International Labor Organization and International Maritime Organization Port Code of Conduct. That was created in the time where most people were thinking, war on terror, anti-terrorism, right? You even think of the OAS Maritime and Port Security Program. I mean, that's under the Inter-American Initiative of Anti-Terrorism, right? But as we live in a world that's so interconnected, cybersecurity, Internet of Things, ports having such crucial information flowing through it, I think we really need to be thinking about ports as a real target for potential espionage, potential control, and potential areas in the larger scale of geostrategic strategic competition between the U.S. and China. And so what I've been learning and hearing about a lot from fellow colleagues in the national security space, folks within and outside of government, is this concern that the PRC and various state-owned enterprises could be leveraging the 129 ports around the world for commercial purposes, but also potentially for security, espionage, and God forbid, military purposes down the line. And of course, Latin America and the Caribbean is a key region in that as well. So first, thinking about the least likely scenario, right? But a scenario nonetheless. If there was ever a conflict between the U.S. and China over the Taiwan Straits, right? China is of course doing a united sword military exercise over Taiwan right now as we speak. Could the PRC, through its 2017 National Intelligence Law, require PRC state-owned enterprises or private companies like Hutchinson Holdings to restrict U.S. naval or commercial access in some of these key ports, especially the ones around sea lines of communication, strategic choke points, Panama Canal, Strait of Magellan, Caribbean approaches. That's one. But another scenario under the threshold of war or conflict is surveillance and espionage. And we have seen, rather the Biden administration has already issued restrictions on two companies in particular, ZPMC, which creates port cranes, and NukeTech, which creates port scanners. Now, according to a recent MITRE report, ZPMC has about 70% of the global market share of container cranes around the world. And that's 80% of cranes in the United States. And of course, there are a lot in Latin America and the Caribbean as well. And there's concern that, of course, ZPMC and NukeTech could be gathering proprietary information, biometric information, proprietary commercial data from potential competitor companies, and then send that back to Beijing. And that's an issue as well. And then the last portion is of course the potential illicit activity around Chinese owned ports. And of course, Chris, Henry, we've had the discussions about this, and there really is no smoking gun per se, right? There is no correlation, right, saying that because a port is owned by a Chinese company, it is more prone to illegal activity. But there are some examples. And I want to bring up the incredible work of an NGO called Earth League International, which has really mapped out Chinese illegal activities throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And they specifically mention several ports: Puerto Caldera in Costa Rica, Puerto de Balboa, of course, the terminal that Hutchinson holds in Panama, Puerto Bolivar in Ecuador, Puerto Callao in Peru, Puerto Buenaventura and Tumaco in Colombia, and of course the port of Manzanillo in Mexico, also run by Hutchinson Holdings. So Chinese illegal networks are leveraging those ports in order to ship jaguar skins, shark fins, and other illegal wildlife to China in order to satiate the demand for illegal Chinese, or rather traditional Chinese medicine. So I think I'll stop there, but these are the ways in which ports can be leveraged in the larger geostrategic competition.
Thanks, Leland. Yeah, we'll get into a bunch of these things. Particularly, I'm going to ask all of you at some point when we're done with the opening remarks to give us your opinion about whether you think Chinese controlled or operated ports in the region are preferred ports, or are ports that are preferred by criminal organizations, given certain particularities of those ports and the differences that they have with ports that are either run by national authorities or by other multinational companies. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Doug.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you to CSIS and Carolina and Leland and folks. It's great to see everyone here. I think what I'd like to talk about a little bit, and I just did a paper for Leland's organization at FIU, looking at what I call the fourth wave of transnational organized crime in the hemisphere, because I think we are really looking at a radically changing dynamic in which ports are becoming increasingly important. I think that the traditional models and what I call the first three phases, I won't go through them all now, but when you have one product, cocaine, going to the United States, which was one market, and then the money coming back. And then all three of the previous iterations of the transnational organized crime wave, that was basically it. And now you have a series of new transnational actors, the 'Ndrangheta from Italy, the Albanians, the Turkish groups all coming in, all moving their products traditionally through ports in Europe and in Turkey and multiple other places, and the port-to-port relationship as these extra regional actors expand their presence in the hemisphere, I think are incredibly important. And I think that we're looking at a radically changed transnational organized crime, and particularly drug trafficking landscape now. We had cocaine, as I said, going to one particular market and the money coming back. Now we have cocaine moving to Europe, moving to Asia. And just as importantly, the consumption in the United States of cocaine is way down and the consumption of synthetic drugs is way up, which means we have this new market for these incredibly cheap drugs that are easy to make and rely on an entirely different set of precursor chemicals that are being brought in almost entirely into ports by Chinese companies from 3 specific Chinese provinces, as identified by Insight Crime, where about 80% of the precursors come from, a little bit from India. But that has changed the whole dynamic. We are still in port security looking at essentially large shipments of cocaine going one way, right? We have not broadened our horizons yet. But if you look at what the Chinese are trying to do in Puerto Coronel in Chile, take over there, they're moving into control and trying to have the most direct control possible of the Straits of Magellan and the Southern Passage, as the Panama Canal is becoming increasingly at risk as a mover of huge volumes because of the water scarcity. As we look at the Chinese development of the ports in Peru, we're going to have a significantly reoriented port structure and how things move across the hemisphere. And in each of those, the Chinese are playing an enormous role, and transnational organized crime is already trying to embed itself in there. And I think that the way to start looking at things is I think, a dual phenomenon, which is consolidation of the upper level transnational criminal organizations, the Ndrangheta, the Albanians, who run things not only on Latin American level to a large degree now, but also on a global level, where they are sort of traffic cops between what the Cartel de Sinaloa can do, what Jalisco Nueva Generación can do, what the PSC in Brazil can do as far as moving their products into Europe. And at the bottom level, I was just in Guayaquil and Duran a couple of weeks ago, this massive scramble for territory among the local groups whose value added in the supply chain of all of these new commodities is their control of territory. So if you're Albanian organized crime and you want to go into Guayaquil, you can't just walk in and set up shop. You have to have some group who protect your territory, move you to the port, show you how it works, and then guarantee your products coming in and out. And that's the Lobos, the Choneros, the Latin Kings. Those groups are the violence around Guayaquil centers on the control of territory of those groups on behalf of much larger structures. And Guayaquil, I was expecting something different when looking at the port, and we had a chance to go deep into the ports with the Coast Guard and the Ecuadorian Navy. And it's not a port. It's 7 ports divided along multiple river inlets that mostly abut against very poor neighborhoods, comunas, and slums in Guayaquil, where anything can happen anytime, and protected mangrove groves all around, so you can move in and out. Basically an impossible situation to control. It's not something, and I hear a lot of people, and I have said it myself, well, they should really control the port of Guayaquil. Well, they can't. Simply put, it's just way too diversified, way too spread out, unless you put in significant huge investment in that, and Ecuador can't do that right now. So you have this opportunity for all these local groups to move in, and that's what's driving the violence. So I think that as you look across the landscape now, we have to reconceptualize. I think Leland said it at the beginning about we're not looking at just at cocaine now. We're looking at illicit pharmaceuticals in huge amounts, timber, gold, the precursors coming in, and how things are packaged and then moved on. So I think we're in a much more diversified atmosphere than we normally consider. Imports are the place now, because as the traffic moves to Europe, it's much easier to move by ship than by plane for large quantities of timber and gold and cocaine, etc. So I think we have to rethink everything we think about illicit traffic in the region, because the world has changed dramatically. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. And I think we also have to really rethink how we go after and detect these different commodities that these organized crime groups have gotten into and are thus using ports to ship to other destinations. Henry, I'll turn to you.
Thank you, Chris. And I want to begin by saying what an honor it is to be with such esteemed panelists, to be part of this panel today. I also would be remiss if I didn't thank my co-authors on the piece, The Geopolitics of Port Security in the Americas, our satellite imagery team, Joe Bermudez and Jennifer Jun, who did some really excellent work putting together some satellite analysis of the port of Chancay, which I'm sure is going to come up at length in today's discussion. Also, at the risk of sort of tooting CSIS's own horn, I want to reflect on the title of today's event, which is Navigating Security and Geopolitics in the Hemisphere. And what I've heard from my fellow panelists today is that we're really at the convergence of two pressures in the region. On the one hand, the rise of great power competition, which has seen renewed interest in Chinese owned and operated ports throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, and that's what I'm going to be focusing many of my remarks on here today. But on the other, what Doug and Carolina just spoke about, which is the fact that ports are taking on renewed importance for criminal organizations throughout the hemisphere, and I think it wouldn't necessarily be unfair of me to say that as we look out at the hemisphere today, you have only two types of ports: the ones that have an organized crime problem and the ones that will have an organized crime problem. And as we're seeing those pressures converging, port security and geopolitics are really two sides of the same coin. And I think I want to focus on that in my remarks today, but begin with offering a little bit of situational awareness on geopolitics. One thing that, and I think Leland covered many of the risks that we're seeing of Chinese PRC investments in port infrastructure very well, but one thing that we set out to do here at CSIS with some of our recent work on China's investments in ports is really sort of establish some common language, something we often don't see. There's a number of different figures, statistics floating out there. The Council on Foreign Relations has an excellent tracker of Chinese investments in ports, but it's one of many. Aid Data has another one. Some work by some scholars in international security put forward a different list of PRC ports. And then U.S. Southern Command has said that there's 40 Chinese owned or operated ports in the hemisphere. So we've been kind of searching for a number, but within that number, there's a lot of diversity. There's immense variation in terms of whether China has merely financed the modernization of a port, like it did in Santiago de Cuba, the port of Santiago, versus the case of Chancay, where POSCO, state-owned enterprise, is both building and then will be the exclusive operator of a megaport. So I think that in my remarks and in our analysis, we thought it better, rather than trying to search for a number, we thought it better to enumerate a couple of common risks to frame how we look at various PRC-owned ports. And the three risks that I'm gonna focus on in my remarks are the potential for intelligence collection, control over preferred logistics routes, and the potential for military use, adversarial military use, or sabotage. Intelligence collection was covered excellently by Leland in his remarks. We know that the PRC has used and has the ability to use not only the actual ownership of ports itself, where you're an owner, you can see the manifests and see the data of the ships coming in, but also the associated infrastructure, the cameras, the scanners, the cranes that mean that China can have a presence in far more ports than we can really put a number on. Because if you have ZPMC cranes, automatically there's some level of risk, there's some baseline risk that under the national security law, the PRC, the CCP could order ZPMC to turn over the data on that particular port, turn over the camera feeds, basically. So that's a very widespread, broad-based risk of intelligence gathering. The second level of risk is control over preferred logistics routes. That means that basically, that's a risk in particular for owners or operators of ports, where an operator can artificially slow down or speed up the movement of goods through particular ports, can seize potentially critical goods when paired with that kind of intelligence capacity to surgically target critical shipments of, say, chips or minerals or foodstuffs, and throw a wrench into the global economy and the regional economy at a time of where it could be most impactful. And then the final risk, and the one that I think we see get brought up most often in conversations about the risk of China in regional ports, is the military or the military adversarial military use. That in the time of conflict, China could use its position, its power position in Latin America's ports to assist with resupply and logistics for the PLA Navy. And we've seen around the world ports that PRC firms have built have been constructed to the specifications that would allow them to dock warships. And Isaac Hart and Wendy Lutert have done some really amazing work in highlighting how these ports give China, the PLA, a sort of soft power projection capacity, allowing the PLA to fulfill its global ambitions without going through the work of negotiating hosting agreements and basing agreements with particular countries around the world. Now, I think if we were to see a conflict breakout, say over the Taiwan Straits, I think it would be still pretty cagey. The region might be fairly hesitant to allow the PLA to dock or use particular ports. But we shouldn't discount number one, the potential for pre-positioning certain military assets in the Western Hemisphere, and number two, the potential for sabotage. Especially, I'm thinking of sea lines of communication, the Panama Canal, blocking access for even a couple of days in a conflict scenario could have significant implications. But what I want to kind of conclude by laying out the role of these risks is these risks manifest in different ways across different types of ports. Again, you have the example from Santiago de Cuba, where it really was a modernization project, but research from CSIS suggests that may have played a role in some of the PRC's intelligence collection efforts elsewhere on the island. So there's an intelligence risk there, but there's not really a serious military risk or a serious supply chain logistical risk. Versus the port of Chancay, where you sort of have the whole shebang in terms of intelligence gathering risks, reorienting and rerouting supply chains through this PRC controlled port, and then the ability to dock naval vessels within that port. So we think that hopefully laying out these risks and getting some sort of shared language will allow us to have a more fruitful conversation when we go forward and discuss this.
Thanks very much, Henry. I'm certainly going to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on the port of Chancay, given that it really is sort of the emblematic port that we should be worried about, both from a geostrategic perspective and a public safety or criminality perspective, especially since the area where it is really not prepared for the inevitable arrival of organized crime. I want to turn now to our discussion and ask Carolina. Argentina has been dealing with the rise in violence driven mainly from drug trafficking through the port of Rosario, as well as other ports further upstream on the Paraguay-Paraná waterway. How has the Milei administration sought to restore control over these hotspots? And what lessons, if any, can be learned from Brazil, which has had a long-standing history of drug trafficking challenges through its own ports?
Okay, thank you, Chris. It's a very tough question. Well, actually, during the last Milei administration, the security issue in Rosario is much better. The numbers are talking themselves. Homicide have been going down and down in the last 6 months. It's not been such a long time, but the difference are very important. We are talking about 4 homicide every 100 inhabitants, which is very low for our region in general. And Rosario in particular has been impacted by the presence of different forces, not only policial forces, but intermediate forces Argentina has. So the presence of these intermediate forces has done a very big job. And I have to say that the security ministry, Patricia Bullrich, has shown a very important concern and presence in the region, and that seems to have helped control the problem. But I have to say that I really don't think that the problem in Rosario is directly related to transnational crime, transnational movement. It has more to do with what Doug was discussing about these local criminal organizations that manage, control, and maybe they are hired by traditional big organizations such as the Ndrangheta or the Albanian mafia or the Serbian mafia, or whatever they may be. Different is the case of Paraguay, for example, which we all know is very complicated, especially since the PCC has arrived and has implemented such as a hub of redistribution, not only of marijuana, but also of cocaine and different kind of illicit activities. So if we have to talk about Brazil, I really don't think we have a lot to learn from them. They have a lot of problems, and it's true that they have seen a decrease in the violence levels, but the truth is that in many, many cases, in many states, that has to do more with presence and the control of the PCC, and not of it's not related necessarily with the action of the state. So I really don't see, unfortunately, I would like to say something different, except from maybe from the case of the Puerto Santos. And in the case of Santo, we have seen much control. I think one of the previous panelists mentioned that the problem is we cannot control too much, because otherwise it will be very difficult to keep commerce going. So we need to let commerce flow, and we can control a little. And if we can control a little, we may see some displacement from criminal organizations, such as the case from Santos to the southern ports.
Yeah, this question of balancing security needs on the one hand, but the efficiency of port operations, particularly when it comes to perishable agricultural products, is key, and that's why we see cocaine often disguised in shipment of fresh fruits or flowers, or increasingly out of Ecuador in shipments of banana containers. And the other thing I think I gather from what you just said, and this is interesting, building a little bit on what Doug said, is it seems that in some ports, like Rosario, certainly Guayaquil, you have sort of an atomization of control. There are smaller groups that are controlling, and they're trying to outcompete each other and show how effective they are and how violent they can be. And then they get hired by maybe the international criminal organizations for a specific service at that port. And I want to keep talking about that, but to go into the Chinese dimension for a minute. When we talk about ports in Latin America, really, for the most part, it's really been when we talk about Chinese-controlled ports, I should say, it's really been about the geopolitical competition and what this means. And so back to something we talked about at the very beginning, Leland, to what extent, if at all, have you observed, you mentioned the Eli work, but to what extent have you observed Chinese-owned or operating ports being more or less secure than those controlled by other companies? Meaning, are these destinations of choice for organized crime? Because all ports seem to suffer from some level of use or of use by organized crime. But is there something particular about Chinese-controlled ports that makes them particularly attractive for organized crime?
Well, if we were to look at the 7 ports that Earth League International had specifically referenced, right? Of those 7, really only 2 of them have Chinese ownership, right? So what I mentioned before, the port terminal in Balboa, and of course the port of Manzanillo in Mexico. And so I'm not necessarily sure there's a smoking gun that directly ties, say, Chinese-run ports or the lack of security measures in Chinese ports with the increase of illicit activities. What I will say is that the various Chinese criminal organizations throughout the region have a really vast network of bribing officials. There's a Chinese saying, 睁一只眼闭一只眼, which is to keep one eye open and keep one eye closed, right? To pay people off to turn a blind eye to things. And so you see that consistently time and time again, whether it be in various ports that they leverage in Latin America and the Caribbean, or the ones in China, right? There's a key port, the port of Xiamen in Fujian province. Apparently, these various Chinese networks have bribed a lot of officials there in order to accept a lot of the shipping. A couple other things I want to mention is, to Henry's point, you're saying, there are ports that have illicit activities or illicit crime, and there are the ones that are going to have it. And I can't agree more. And so, of course, I know you're going to talk about Chancay. Everybody's going to talk about that. But I also want to mention another key shipping route that just opened up. And this is the one between Zhoushan Island in Zhejiang province and Guyana in Suriname. Again, ELI has identified a illegal Chinese network that's based in Guyana and Suriname in terms of illegal timber export, illegal wildlife export, and already they are exporting those products to Zhoushan. So when you have now a direct shipping line that's going to actually decrease the amount, I think right now it takes about 100 days for ships to pass from Zhoushan to Guyana and back. Now it's going to cut it by half to about 47 days. You're absolutely going to see an increase in the illegal and also the illicit activities there as well.
Thanks, Leland. And I kind of want to ask the same question to Doug. You mentioned the Eli report. Leland only mentioned a couple of ports that were controlled by China. But I mean, in Mexico, the port of Lázaro Cárdenas, Ensenada, Manzanillo, they're the three biggest ports in the Mexican port system. They're all controlled by Hutchinson Ports. And we know that they've been used to import chemical precursors from China in large quantities, which for the most part are used for fentanyl. Well, at least the illicit uses of them are for fentanyl and other drugs. And on the way out, we know that some of these ports, particularly Lázaro Cárdenas, has a history of exporting illegally mined ore that's sent to China, and timber also that's also sent to China. So are we still just talking circumstantial evidence, maybe, Doug, or is there some sort of can we see smoke somewhere yet? Oh, you're on mute, Doug.
Sorry, I agree with Leland. I think what we see, what my direct experience has been at the ports in Central America, in Honduras and elsewhere, where you see where the Chinese control appear, no one else is allowed to inspect that. So we had access for a while to some of the shipping manifests of product coming in on Chinese ships into Puerto Cortes in Honduras and elsewhere. And they were absurd. They were like 800 tons of tomatoes on an unrefrigerated boat that supposedly came across the ocean to a country that produces tomatoes. Another one's like 300 tons of garlic. Well, that's not what's on the boat, right? But what we were told repeatedly, this was in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, is that when ships come in, if there is an inspection about to take place, they simply call the commander and say, call them off, and the police retreat. They pull their product back until everyone's gone, and then they pull it out. So there's no correlation between manifests and product arriving. Is that organized crime? it's hard to say. I think it's state-sponsored illicit activity. I'm not sure how much it involves transnational organized crime on the ground there. I think in some of these cases we're pretty sure, but we don't have the chemical analysis to prove it, that those were precursors coming in for the manufacture of synthetic drugs, which then would feed into transnational organized crime directly. But I think what we know with a high level of certainty is that when they control their ports, there's no correlation between what they say comes in and what actually comes in. And there's no ability or no desire of the states hosting those ports to verify or do anything about that, or to further identify those products. I think the idea of one eye open and one eye closed is perfect, because they negotiated. Every shipment that came in was negotiated, and every shipment that was attempted to be, we talked to policemen, like they weren't like being heroic people trying to do something. They were just going to do a regular inspection. And then they're getting other colonels like screaming at them, like, get out of there, get away. And they'd back off, and then they'd watch the product go back into the reserved area until they were out of the way, and then they would come back out. So is it transnational organized crime? I don't know. Is it definitely illicit state-sponsored activity in moving product, even at a minimum to avoid taxes or whatever? But I think probably much more than that. I think definitely. And I feel confident saying that part of it.
So at a minimum, it's an area that needs further research to see what's going on. Henry, I want to now turn to you. I know you've been chomping at the bit to talk a little bit about Chancay. Earlier, Leland mentioned that ports are a real sort of target for espionage, for control, for strategic competition between the United States and China. Tell us how the port of Chancay, fits the bill for that. And also, please, since it's a port that's just about to open, I believe in November it will be inaugurated. On the public security side, what is being done? Is the port ready? Is the town ready for what is inevitably going to be a massive amount of legitimate commerce, but concealed within it, certainly illicit commodities as well?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think if you look at the list of risks that I laid out, and then on top of that you add what we've been talking about the intersection between Chinese-owned ports and organized crime, Chancay ticks all the boxes. And I would say that there's a reason that there's been so much attention paid to this port. But I want to start, and I want to kind of ground this in something we saw earlier this year, where the Peruvian government went to the courts to say that we found a secret clause or an unbeknownst clause in the contract, unbeknownst to us, giving COSCO, the Chinese state-owned company that has constructed the port, exclusive rights over operating. I mentioned this before, but basically saying we can't do that. That's not what our legal regime governing port security and port operations guarantees. And COSCO, in retaliation, threatened to completely pull back from the port and leave them sort of empty-handed with a major unfinished infrastructure investment that they've got to foot the bill for, pretty much. They want to see any gain from that. That's a pretty clear example of how these port investments and relying on the PRC for economic development and economic security can be a risk to countries in the region. We talk about the risk to the United States, but I think it's worthwhile highlighting this as an example of the risk to the United States' regional allies and partners as we approach the port of Chancay. And then getting to your question about, is the town itself ready? Chancay is not a major logistics hub. It is a relatively small, pre-existing port, but heavily focused on a little bit of tourism, a lot of fishing. From what I've spoken to, the police force in numbers in maybe the dozens. It's not a force that's capable, that's equipped and prepared to handle becoming one of the largest potentially shipping destinations in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that, and you're simultaneously seeing a country, the broader country context, where Peru is witnessing a significant uptick in organized crime activity. There's a lot of Peru is the second largest cocaine producing country in the world. And there's existing illegal gold trade, illegal wildlife trade, illegal timber trade, much of it tied to China. It's hard to see, I think, how having a brand new port with a direct line to one of the biggest markets for illicit commodities will not be sort of having criminal groups chomping at the bit themselves to take advantage of that. And then what I want to close on is saying that in response, if we know that Chancay is going to be operations going to be inaugurated by Xi Jinping himself in November when he arrives, when he tours there, what the United States should be doing is dramatically stepping up cooperation with the Peruvian customs authorities and police forces to help them get ready for becoming the locus of a potential surge in criminal activity. But you add that geopolitical dimension there, you add the competition between the United States and China, and you're seeing that at a time when we need more intelligence sharing, more cooperation, and more coordination, that there's this roadblock that's being thrown up. And I think that's what's very much concerning to me about the potential for Chancay to become a new hub for organized criminal activity and navigating these security and geopolitics concerns.
Yep, and it's not the only Chinese port on the, well, this one is about to be inaugurated, but the Chinese are going to build another one in Peru at Maricona, which, while not as large as Chancay, will also present new problems. We have just barely under 10 minutes left. I'd like to get one more round of questions from everybody. You can just try to keep your answers fairly short. Carolina, going back to the beginning, you talked about these non-traditional ports in the Southern Cone that are increasingly used for trafficking drugs, and that they don't seem to raise the same level of concern in destination countries in Europe, for instance, as maybe a port in Ecuador or a port in Colombia. At what point do they become a concern? Knowing that traffickers are always adapting to new routes, shouldn't we be, or shouldn't the Europeans and other destination countries, shouldn't they be equally vigilant with all ports?
Thank you, Chris, for the question. Absolutely. It's very easy to answer. Yes, we should check on everything that comes from different places. But it's true that we need risk management in order to, with the use of intelligence, try to control the best we can do regarding the fact that we don't have complete information and we have tons and millions of containers moving around the world. And I wanted to jump in what some of the other panelists were discussing. And I want to highlight that it's not only that Chinese control or Chinese administration ports are one of the risks, but it's the port to the Asian market. And that's something that Doug just mentioned. And it's a very big market, not only China, and the fact that we don't have enough information of what happens there. We have some information from Hong Kong and from China, Macau, but we don't have information from China itself. But we have, and we need to keep on watching what is happening in Asia with cocaine and with different kind of illicit goods that are coming from Latin America. And having that port in Peru and using the Pacific route, it's something to bear in mind.
Thanks very much, Carolina. Leland, how can the U.S. better compete with China in the realm of port infrastructure and security, especially since the U.S. itself is not home to a significant number of companies with port security, with port construction, and with maritime logistics experience?
I want to first actually lift up a key part, I think the beginning of Henry's paper, where you talk about the hearing in 1990 when 1999, when the Panama Canal was being given back to the Panamanians, and it was a House committee, I think, on financial services, and one of the people who testified was a Dr. Tomás Cabal of the University of Panama, who was a former DEA agent. And Henry, you and I have talked about this. Holy crap! The things that he said of the dangers associated with having Hutchinson Whampoa at the time operate the two key ports terminals along the canal. I mean, he talks about the potential for dual use. He talked about the connections that the CEO at the time, Li Ka-shing, had with the PLA and Costco shipping. And he also mentioned the potential rise of Chinese organized crime. He mentioned triads and the rise of illegal wildlife and human trafficking. And he also talked about how the PRC would eventually leverage its increased economic influence in order to pressure Panama to switch diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to mainland China. So all of those things have essentially come to pass. And so I say that just to say that the U.S. really needs to, or rather, U.S. officials really need to look at this as a real potential challenge, right? I think, whether it be MITRE, whether it be some of these other organizations, when they think about potential Chinese basing, they're only focusing on the Indo-Pacific, or maybe some African countries. Very little are they really focusing on the potential for Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think that's one. Two is, Chris, to your point, there aren't any sort of big name U.S. sort of shipping operators, but there already has been some support. Let's say the DFC, right, the Development Finance Corporation, providing loans to Ilport, which is a Turkish port operator for the Port of Bolivar, to expand the Port of Bolivar in Ecuador, right? I think that's a good template or example in which U.S. financing can support a company of an allied or partner country in order to come in and help to outcompete a Chinese bidder going forward.
Yeah, that makes good sense. And again, we've just got a few more minutes left, so if I could get two more questions in real quick. Doug, given the increase in cocaine trafficking to Europe that you've described, that I think everybody's described, what is the role of transatlantic cooperation on port security? To what extent is cooperation ongoing between European and Latin American or Caribbean governments on the issue?
Well, I think that we're still in the phase where people are not attuned to what's actually happening. We're still in the phase of denial. I spent a lot of time in Chile and Argentina and Uruguay, and they are not yet believing what is happening in front of their eyes in terms of how things are moving. I think they're starting to become alarmed. Chile is now suddenly taking a huge interest in this type of thing. And I think the Europeans are in the same boat. They're not used to this. Cocaine went to the United States. It wasn't really their problem. Some went to Spain, okay, whatever. So I think that when I was talking about what a radically different environment we're in, this is part of it, and we're very slow at adjusting to these types of new environments, and switching policies and allocating resources and while the criminal side is very quick to adapt, adjust, find holes, and move forward. And part of it is simple economics. Cocaine in the U.S. is about 17,000 a kilo in Miami. It's 35 or 40 in Spain. It's 70 in the former Soviet republics. If you're a businessman, what do you do? You look to maximize profit. It hit 250,000 in Australia a year or so ago. So they're going to go where the money is, and so that's we're not used to thinking. We think that it's monolithic and stable, and it's not. And just one small comment on what Leland was saying about the Panama Canal. And I was at the Washington Post when all of that was happening, and I wrote a big story about how Hutchinson Whampoa was, who they were and what they were, and that is the closest I've ever come to being sued. They went absolutely ballistic and denied it and denounced me. It was like this huge thing, and I was like, "Oh my God, was it? Did I mess up?" And apparently not. But it was a very, very tense time. The post editors were great, but it was really funny because they just went completely crazy over the suspicion that they might somehow be tied to the Chinese mainland government and do something nefarious along the way. Is striking hearing you say that. Brought back a lot of memories.
So my last question goes to you, Henry, and really it's also given some of the other work you've done on economic activities by China in the region and how they're having pernicious effects on some of the on democratic backsliding on some of the region's democracies. How does the PRC's involvement in regional ports influence local governance and transparency and the ability of host nations to regulate foreign investments in strategic assets?
Thank you, Chris, and thanks to everyone for joining this panel discussion. It's a challenge. I'm going to try and wrap up so many different threads and productive directions. I hope this is a conversation that we keep on having. I'll conclude, or what I would say to that, Chris, is we've often said the strategy the United States should pursue in the region is one of insulation, curtailment, and competition, meaning that we should insulate where China's already established. We need to insulate the most corrosive effects. Where Chinese engagement is really intolerable, we need to curtail that. And then where we can actually outcompete China, we should do that. I think ports is an excellent example of insulation strategies at work. Chinese ports in the region are not going anywhere. Chancay is going to open. It's going to go into operation. And what the United States should be focused on is ensuring that local institutions and national level institutions and actually international level institutions are all prepared to deal with that, to share information, to hold Costco accountable, and to and to do what needs to be done. One key recommendation I would encourage the U.S. policymakers to implement and to go to the region for is there is at the moment no CFIUS equivalent in Latin America, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, that can look at potential investments from foreign governments in critical infrastructure and critical sectors and say whether or not this poses a risk or a geopolitical risk, of a political risk to our government, our sovereignty. Encouraging the United States, or the United States encouraging countries and governments in the region to stand up an institution like that can take a critical look at, hey, PRC is state-owned enterprises coming in. They want to invest in this particular port, or any variety of other critical infrastructure. Electricity generation is another thing that we've gotten into in some of our other work, and make a judgment and say, how can we, if we're going to let it go forward, what mitigation strategies need to be in place, or do we let it go forward? Period, to begin with. I would encourage the United States to make that a point of its diplomacy in the region, and to remember that our security cooperation, our partnership with a lot of the allies and partners remains a historical strength, and that's not something that's going to change. That's something, more intelligence sharing, more cooperation. It is something that's going to be welcomed, and it's going to be increasingly important as we try and navigate between security and geopolitics in Latin American ports.
And we'll have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank our four panelists, Carolina Sampo, Leland Lazarus, Doug Farah, and of course, Henry Ziemer, for being with us today. And remind our audience to please complete the survey if you can once the call ends. Thank you very much. Have a good day.